In America, a lawyer will take a case on a win-only basis. He will have offers, won't he? Should he take them up, do you think, Aisha?
No, not at all. I mean, I don't know what is wrong with this man. I think he's got severe mental health issues. But quite frankly, I think he comes across as a very unpleasant, toxic, publicity-hungry weirdo. And if I were them, I would get a restraining order against him. It is their right as parents to decide who the children see and who they don't. He doesn't have some automatic right. And the way he's conducting himself, every time he goes on TV, he makes it worse. If he really wants to rebuild bridges, and I understand how difficult this is, I know people that have been estranged from their family, very, very, very difficult. But if you want to build a bridge back to your family, you don't go running to the press the whole time. You keep your head down. You maybe write private letters. You get yourself together, and then you gently put out some olive
Mike,
branches.
you think he has got the right?
Well, I think that's a terribly unfair characterisation of Thomas Markle, who I think has been treated despicably and dreadfully by Harry and Meghan. I think they decided early on, we want this guy out of our life. He's too much of an embarrassment. Now, if you remember, it all started with the paparazzi pics, OK? And he was approached by a load of photographers who said, you know, you look like a fat old guy and you're going to be the father of the Queen of England. We can help you with your image. So he fell for it. He didn't get any money. He fell for it and he said, OK. And they took the pictures of him looking at a computer and getting fitted for his suit, OK? The next thing is the People article. The People's the biggest selling magazine in the world. They publish a part of a letter from Meghan, which makes him look dreadful. And all he did was reply to an inquiry from the Mail on Sunday to put the record straight.
And then it's such a surprise. He then ends up on Good Morning Britain, and then he ends up on another. It's like he's very unlucky.
He has criticised her, hasn't he?
Yes, he has criticised her, and she deserves criticism for treating your father like that. She's pushed her father right out of her life because he doesn't fit her image. She wants to be the most cool and famous woman in the world, and she doesn't want this rather overweight guy living in Mexico, her father, to be anywhere near her. And I think it's disgraceful.
Mike,
and I think the fact that
Aisha, come back in.
Yeah.
His actions and the way he's reacted to this, also not just him, but her absolutely vile half-siblings as well, who are like coining it in left, right and centre.
That's not him.
From they have spoken to him about
Samantha?
it. Yes, Samantha. I don't blame her. I think you have every right, if a family member is being toxic to you, you can cut them out.
I don't think he's being toxic. How's he been toxic?
What? He goes on TV at the drop of a hat.
He goes on TV to try and defend himself against continuous attacks from Harry and Meghan's camp. Her friends got together and stitched him up, and it ended up in a popular magazine. He had every right to defend himself.
His grandson, and quite frankly, if I were them, I would keep their grandkids so far away from him.
I wonder whether
leaving
Thomas Markle out of it, I wonder whether actually a grandparent does have the right. I think I might feel I've got the right if my kids had children and they didn't like me. I could say, well, I still want to see my grandchildren. I think it depends, right? So if, for example, you had played a huge role in bringing up those children and those children had known you from when they were wee and you had been a huge part of their life, this is a very different scenario.
There is something deeply revealing about the way the Thomas Markle story keeps being recycled. Every few months the same question comes back. Does Thomas Markle deserve access to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's children simply because he is their grandfather? And the answer is not as simple as some television commentators would have you believe. Because being a biological relative does not automatically create an unlimited right to someone's private life. And being a grandparent does not mean that parents surrender their right to decide who is allowed into their children's world. That is especially important when the relationship has become intensely public, emotionally charged, and repeatedly discussed in the media. A recent Jeremy Vine discussion once again put the issue under the microscope. One commentator argued that Harry and Meghan should consider seeking a restraining order against Thomas Markle, while another strongly defended Thomas and portrayed him as a father who had been unfairly rejected by his daughter. But underneath that heated television debate is a much bigger question. Who gets to decide where the boundaries are when a family relationship becomes a public spectacle? And if Harry and Meghan believe that keeping distance is what protects their family, why should television commentators, newspaper columnists, or anyone else get to tell them otherwise? Let's be honest about what happened. The public was introduced to Thomas Markle long before Prince Harry and Meghan became parents. But the relationship between father and daughter became a global media story around Meghan's wedding to Harry. Thomas became the subject of enormous attention. There were staged paparazzi photographs, there were interviews, there were newspaper stories, there were public statements, there were family members speaking publicly. And eventually the private family conflict became entertainment for millions of people around the world. That is where the situation becomes complicated. Supporters of Thomas argue that he was treated terribly and that Meghan abandoned her father. Critics of Thomas argue that repeatedly speaking publicly about his daughter, especially when she has chosen not to engage publicly, makes reconciliation even more difficult. And this is where I think the conversation needs to change. Because instead of endlessly asking, why doesn't Meghan reconcile with her father? Perhaps people should ask a different question. Why does everyone assume Meghan owes the public a reconciliation? She doesn't. Her marriage is private. Her children are private. Her family relationships are private, and her boundaries are hers to establish. Imagine for a moment that this was not Meghan. Imagine she was an ordinary woman with a complicated relationship with her father. Imagine that every disagreement between them was being discussed on breakfast television. Imagine newspapers were publishing stories about their arguments. Imagine television personalities were debating whether her children should see their grandfather. Imagine her father could go on television whenever he wanted to explain his side of the story. Would people still insist that she had a duty to repair that relationship publicly? Probably not. Yet, because Meghan married Prince Harry, people seem to believe that every aspect of her family life became public property. It didn't. And Prince Harry has a role in this too. He is not merely Meghan's husband, he is also a father. He has the responsibility of deciding what he believes is appropriate for his children, and that decision should not be dictated by strangers on television. The Sussex children have grown up under extraordinary circumstances. Their parents have spent years dealing with intense media attention, criticism, and public scrutiny. Harry has repeatedly spoken about the dangers of intrusive press coverage and the effect that relentless publicity can have on families. So when people ask why Harry and Meghan don't simply expose their children to every relative who wants access to them, they are ignoring the reality of the situation. Children are not bargaining chips. They are not public relations tools. And they certainly should not be used to settle adult family disputes. This is precisely why the argument that he's their grandfather is incomplete. Being a grandfather is a relationship. It is not a magical entitlement. Healthy family relationships are built on trust, consistency, respect, and boundaries. And when trust has broken down, rebuilding it takes more than appearing on television and explaining why you believe you have been wronged. In fact, that may make things considerably harder. This was one of the strongest points raised in the Jeremy Vine discussion. One speaker essentially argued that if someone genuinely wants to rebuild a damaged family relationship, repeatedly going to the media may not be the most effective strategy. That is worth considering. Because if your ultimate goal is reconciliation, what happens when every public interview becomes another chapter in the conflict? Every interview creates another headline. Every headline creates another reaction. Every reaction creates another story. And suddenly the family dispute becomes an endless media cycle. There is no privacy left. There is no room for quiet conversations. There is no room for people to change their minds without being watched. And there is certainly no room for healing away from the cameras. Now, supporters of Thomas will say that he has also been responding to criticism. They will argue that he has been trying to defend himself. And that is a fair point to raise. But defending yourself publicly and repeatedly keeping a family dispute in the public arena are not necessarily the same thing. At some point, someone has to step away from the microphone. And if Meghan and Harry have chosen to step away, that choice deserves to be respected. One of the arguments made against Meghan in the discussion was that she supposedly wanted to distance herself from her father because he did not fit the image she wanted to project. But notice what that argument does. It turns Meghan's personal boundary into a character judgment. Instead of asking whether there may be painful reasons for the distance, it assumes the worst possible motivation. That is something Meghan has experienced repeatedly. Her critics often take a complicated situation and reduce it to the most hostile interpretation possible. If she protects her privacy, she's accused of being cold. If she speaks, she's accused of seeking attention. If she doesn't speak, she's accused of hiding something. If she sets boundaries, she's accused of being cruel. It becomes a situation where nothing she does can possibly satisfy her critics. And perhaps that's the point at which we should stop demanding that she satisfy them. Meghan does not need to win a public popularity contest in order to have boundaries. She does not need to convince television commentators that her family decisions are legitimate. And she does not need to provide the public with access to her children simply because someone else believes they deserve it. Now let's talk about the children. This is where the debate becomes particularly important. Prince Archie and Princess Lilibet are not participants in their parents' disagreements. They didn't choose the media attention. They didn't choose the headlines. They didn't choose to be born into one of the world's most famous families. And they certainly didn't choose the complicated relationship surrounding their grandfather. So why should they be placed in the middle of it? When parents decide that a particular relationship could bring instability, pressure, or unwanted publicity into their children's lives, they have every right to take that seriously. That doesn't mean anyone is saying Thomas Markle is automatically dangerous. It means that parents are allowed to make decisions based on their own judgment and circumstances. And there is a huge difference between saying this person is dangerous and saying we don't believe this relationship is currently healthy for our children. Those are not the same statement. The word restraining order also needs some caution. A restraining order is a legal matter, and whether one is appropriate depends on specific circumstances and applicable law. It should never be treated as a casual solution to an ordinary family disagreement. But the broader principle behind the debate is legitimate. Harry and Meghan have the right to establish boundaries around their family. If those boundaries are respected, there may be no need for anything more. But if boundaries are repeatedly ignored, then it is understandable that people would begin asking what additional protections might be available. And this is where every development. Who said what? Who contacted whom? Who was invited? Who wasn't invited? Who spoke to which newspaper? Who gave which interview? And the more the public consumed the story, the more valuable the story became. That cycle benefits media outlets, but it doesn't necessarily benefit the family involved. And this is why Harry's long-standing criticism of intrusive media deserves to be considered in this conversation. When private pain becomes profitable content, people can become trapped inside a story they never wanted to tell publicly in the first place. Thomas Markle may have his own perspective. He may believe that he has been treated unfairly. He may believe that his side has not been heard. But having a grievance does not automatically mean that broadcasting that grievance is the best way to resolve it. Sometimes the most powerful move is silence. Sometimes the most mature response is a private letter. Sometimes reconciliation begins not with a television appearance, but with giving the other person enough space to breathe. And sometimes reconciliation simply isn't possible. That last possibility makes people uncomfortable. We have been conditioned to believe that every family dispute must eventually end with a dramatic reunion. But real life doesn't work that way. Some relationships are repaired, others aren't, and people are allowed to protect themselves from relationships they believe are damaging. The obsession with forcing Meghan to reconcile with Thomas also reveals something troubling about the way female celebrities are treated. How often do we see people telling famous men that they must repair every broken family relationship? Yet Meghan is constantly expected to perform forgiveness publicly. She must be the perfect daughter, the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect Duchess, the perfect public figure. And when she doesn't fit somebody else's definition of perfection, the criticism begins. But perhaps Meghan is simply a human being who has made difficult decisions about her own life. And perhaps Harry is a husband and father who has decided that protecting his immediate family comes before satisfying public curiosity. There is nothing unreasonable about that. Now, does that mean every criticism of Meghan is automatically wrong? Of course not. Nobody should be above criticism. But criticism should be based on evidence, not assumptions. And it should recognize that there are always two sides to a family dispute, and that the public usually doesn't know everything that happened behind closed doors. That is why we should be careful about declaring one person completely innocent and another completely guilty. But being careful about the facts does not mean abandoning common sense. Common sense tells us that parents should have significant control over who interacts with their children. Common sense tells us that repeated public discussion of private family conflicts can make reconciliation harder. And common sense tells us that if someone wants to rebuild trust, respecting boundaries is usually a better starting point than publicly demanding access. That's why the idea at the heart of this debate deserves attention. Maybe the real issue isn't whether Thomas Markle is entitled to see his grandchildren. Maybe the real issue is whether Harry and Meghan should be allowed to decide that question for themselves. I think they should. And if they believe that stronger legal boundaries are necessary, then that is ultimately a matter for them, their lawyers and the courts, not television commentators. The public can debate, the newspapers can speculate, commentators can argue, but the final decision belongs to the family. And one thing should remain absolutely clear. Archie and Lilibet are children, not characters in a royal family drama. They should not be dragged into adult disputes. They should not become the subject of emotional bargaining. And they should not be treated as prizes that a relative automatically gets access to simply because of a biological connection. If Thomas Markle genuinely wants to rebuild a relationship with his daughter and eventually his grandchildren, perhaps the most productive thing he could do is stop trying to win the argument in the court of public opinion. Because family reconciliation is not a courtroom victory. It isn't a television debate. It isn't a newspaper headline. And it isn't about proving which person is right. It's about trust. It's about boundaries. It's about accountability. And above all, it's about respecting the people who have the power to decide whether the door is open. Harry and Meghan have every right to protect their peace. They have every right to protect their children. they have every right to decide who enters their private world. And the fact that millions of strangers have opinions about those decisions doesn't change that. Perhaps the biggest lesson from this entire saga is one that the royal commentary industry seems determined to ignore. Not every family relationship has to be repaired for public consumption. Sometimes walking away is the boundary. Sometimes silence is the boundary. Sometimes distance is the boundary. And sometimes protecting your children means refusing to let an adult family conflict become their burden. So when the next headline appears asking why Meghan hasn't reconciled with her father, let's remember something. We are seeing fragments of a deeply complicated family history. We don't know every private conversation. We don't know every painful moment. And we certainly don't have the right to demand that Meghan or Harry surrender their boundaries simply because the public wants a reunion. If reconciliation ever happens, it should happen because the people involved genuinely want it, not because television audiences demand it. And if it never happens, that is their decision too. The Sussexes don't owe the world a family reunion. They owe their children love, stability and protection. And that is exactly where their priorities should be. If you agree that Harry and Meghan deserve the right to set boundaries around their family without being endlessly shamed for it, make sure you let me know what you think in the comments. Do you believe Thomas Markle should respect the Sussexes' private boundaries and stop discussing the family publicly? Or do you think he has a legitimate case for wanting contact with his grandchildren? Keep the conversation going, but remember we can disagree without turning someone's private family life into a public battlefield. And if you enjoyed this breakdown and want more commentary defending Harry and Meghan while challenging the double standards surrounding them, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. There is plenty more to unpack, and we will be here to do exactly that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.